You may have seen my previous video from the first time my family and I flew into Mountain Air, North Carolina. Well, this time I want to do a bit of a how-to video and answer some of the frequently asked questions about flying in there. Who can fly into Mountain Air? How do you get permission? What are the procedures, etc.? First, some of the basics. Mountain Air is a private fly-in community in the mountains of western North Carolina, north of Asheville, situated in the Pisgah National Forest, adjacent to the Black Mountain subrange of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is part of the Southern Appalachian Mountains. The Black Mountains are the highest mountains in the eastern United States, and it's home to Mount Mitchell, which is the highest peak east of the Mississippi. Now, there's a process to get approval to fly in there, which I'll get into later in this video. But part of that includes a safety briefing from a member of the Mountain Air Pilots Association. I've included much of that information in this video, but you'll still be required to complete the verbal briefing with a safety officer before getting approval to fly in. Now, about the airport itself. The airport identifier is 2NC0. The airport elevation is 4,432 foot MSL. That makes it the highest elevation airport east of the Mississippi. It's a day VFR only airport, and the runway is 2,875 feet long. Runway 32 is upsloping, is typically used for landings, and has right traffic pattern with a pattern altitude of 5,500 foot MSL. Runway 14 is downsloping and is typically used for takeoff. There's no official AWOS on the field, but there are a number of ways to assess the weather situation. Of course, you can obtain METARs and TAFs from nearby airports, but there are also weather sources on the field at Mountain Air. First, there are 6 runway webcams accessible from the Mountain Air website. Second, there are weather underground stations at either end of the runway, which are also linked from the website. And third, there's a Say Weather station on the field. That's sort of like an unofficial AWOS. And it can be accessed via ForeFlight when flight planning from home, or over the Unicom when approaching the airport. 3 clicks on the Unicom will give you the weather on the approach end of runway 32. 4 clicks will give you the information for runway 14. You'll want to plan to arrive with plenty of fuel, not only so you can reach an alternate airport if necessary, but also because there's no fuel available at the airport. There are a number of airports nearby with instrument approaches that could be used as alternates if you're coming in IFR. Many of these airports have non-standard alternate minimums, so check before filing. The Black Mountains are a J-shaped mountain range. If you can't see the J in this view, I'll select the hazard visor in ForeFlight to highlight it. As I bring the altitude down, you can see the J start to appear. If I select 4,500 foot MSL, the red is basically showing all the terrain that's higher than the airport elevation. As you can see, if you were to do a long, straight-in approach from the southeast, you wouldn't have adequate terrain clearance. The peaks of the mountain range about 6 miles south of the runway are too high to conduct a long straight-in approach at a normal 3-degree glide path angle. So we have a different approach procedure that is somewhat similar to typical traffic pattern entry at an uncontrolled airport, but with some modifications for terrain considerations. Now, it's quite common to have some cloud layers causing mountain obscuration, so be sure to know what the minimum safe altitudes are and check your charts for that. The minimum vectoring altitude in the area is 7,900 foot MSL. If you were arriving on an IFR flight plan, that's the lowest altitude that ATC could clear you to. So if you were to fly in at 8,000 feet and found a solid overcast layer below you, you're not getting in. However, there's often just a scattered layer between 8,000 foot and the field elevation, so you'll need a safe place to let down while maintaining VFR. The recommendation is to arrive over the airport at 8,000 foot and establish visual contact with the runway. This way you can assess the cloud cover and visibility. For those that are on an IFR flight plan, once you have the airport in sight and you're sure that you can maintain VFR, you can go ahead and cancel IFR and switch to Unicom. Listen up on Unicom for other traffic in the area and make your inbound call like you would at any other uncontrolled airport. Someone at the pro shop will typically respond and let you know if any other traffic has been reported in the area. Then provide them your PPR number, and I'll discuss later how you get that. From over the runway, proceed to the town of Burnsville, which is about 3 nautical miles to the northeast of the runway. And that's an area with lower terrain where it's safe to do a descent. From there, you want to maintain VFR. Hopefully, it's a scattered enough area where you can find a large break in the clouds and you can spiral down maintaining VFR over Burnsville down to the traffic pattern altitude of 5,500 foot MSL. I usually head to the east side of Burnsville initially and then do my descending turn to the left. And that puts me in a nice position to do about a 45-degree entry to the right downwind of 3-2. When inbound from Burnsville at traffic pattern altitude, it may be difficult to find the runway initially. Usually the first thing you'll see is the clubhouse and other buildings on the north end of the runway, as well as some of the homes that are on the elevated terrain that overlooks the runway from the west side. And since Burnsville is only 3 miles to the northeast, you won't be on that entry leg for very long. Depending on your turn radius, you may end up turning almost immediately into the right downwind, or at least fairly quickly. While on your downwind, do your landing checks a little bit early and set your GPS up with an inbound course of 320 into the airport. This is because it may be difficult to see the runway when turning from base to final, so that 320 inbound line will sort of give you a final approach course, and that's something for you to aim for and start your turn to final approach. After passing a beam of numbers, you'll first see a narrow wooded valley. Don't turn base there yet. Wait until you see a second valley, which is over the township of Pensacola, and start your base turn there. You'll be able to recognize this because there's a road and some more buildings, a little more development, a series of ponds or small reservoirs. That's the little township of Pensacola, and you start your base turn there. When you start your base turn, start a descent from 5,500, and you're shooting to be about 5,000 feet when you turn base to final. That's about 600 foot above the airport elevation, which is perfect because you're on about a 2-mile final at that point. 300 feet per nautical mile is your normal 3-degree glide path. So 5,000 foot is your perfect altitude to be right on glide path, turning base to final on a 2-mile final. A common threat would be to overshoot the final and end up in a steep bank angle to try to recapture the center line after overshooting it. So that's why you put the 320 inbound course. You can see that course coming in possibly before you see the runway center line coming in, and I'd recommend you just start your base to final turn a little earlier than normal and with a shallower bank angle rather than overshoot and end up having a steeper bank angle to compensate for your overshoot. Double check, make sure that your final gump check or whatever your final landing checks are done, and look for the single Q P-VASI on the left side. This is not a very common type of VASI. You don't see it in many other airports, but it works quite well. And what you're looking for is solid white. Solid white is just right on the glide path. Pulsating white is high, and then red is low, just like other VASIs. Sometimes it's kind of hard to see that in the daylight, but you'll pick it up. So beyond the numbers, you'll see kind of a normal fixed distance markers that would be a good aim point. And then further down the runway, you'll see 2 white lines that are perpendicular to the runway, and that's your latest touchdown point. If you're not touched down on the runway by those stripes, go around. In fact, anything that's not right, do a go around. On final approach, if you found that you've way overshot the center line, go around. If you're too fast, too slow, too high, too low, unstabilized, just go around. That's the smart thing to do rather than try to salvage an unstable approach. One thing you'll want to do before flying in is check your pilot operating manual for your landing and takeoff performance at higher density altitudes. Now, the airport elevation is not as high as a lot of airports out west, but if you're a flat lander, it's higher than you might be used to. And depending on the temperature, the density altitude could be as high as 7,000 feet or more. So on approach, how that's going to impact you is that your true airspeed is going to be faster than it would be at sea level. Now, the rule of thumb is 2% per 1,000 feet. So if your density altitude was 7,000 feet, your true airspeed is 14% higher than your indicated airspeed. So let's say your indicated approach speed is normally 90 knots. You'll still fly your 90 knots, but your true airspeed is going to be 14% higher than that, or about 102, 103 knots. So you may perceive that your speed over the ground is faster, because it is, but be sure to continue to fly your normal indicated approach speed, which is typically 1.3 times VSO in most airplanes. Just know that it may feel faster because it is, and it will also impact your landing distance, and that's why you need to check your books before you come in here.
All right, so approaching mountain air now. Usually when I fly, I typically have weather displaying on my G3X or my ForeFlight, weather radar, that kind of thing. Like I said, it's a VFR airport only, so once you start letting down there, the terrain is a bigger threat than the weather. So I go into here and I turn on my terrain, so it'll show me terrain instead of weather. And then I'll also select profile view, and that brings up a profile on the bottom, and it gives you a visual indication of the terrain relative to your altitude. And you can do the same thing on ForeFlight. Just come up here and select hazard advisor. I usually keep it in the auto, and then it shows terrain that's below your current altitude. Start looking at the weather. It does have a sort of an unofficial AWAS type system. It's called Say Weather. It will update on your ForeFlight if you've got internet. It will not update over ADS-B. But you can, if you click 3 times on the CTAF frequency, it will read out the weather.
Mountain Air Airport, runway 32, automated advisory, wind 160 at 3 knots, temperature 21 Celsius, 2.18 Celsius, altimeter 3009er, density altitude 6,000, airport for private use only. Welcome to the highest runway east of the Mississippi.
And you see I overflew the airport, and now I'm coming over Burnsville. I'm going to circle down. It's nice and scattered clouds, so I can remain VFR, and I know that if I go to 5,500 over Burnsville, I'll be safe. Then I can do the traffic pattern entry to a right downwind for 3. Get your checklist done early so you can concentrate on flying the approach and the terrain. Entering my 320. That'll draw me a line for the approach. Mountain Air traffic, sling 1 off the mic over Burnsville, inbound for a right downwind 32 Mountain Air.
Roger, we have no report air traffic.
Traffic, Cherokee 154 Delta Charlie on the downwind for 2, we exiting the pattern to the south, secure on traffic.
It's hard to see the runway, but you can see some of the houses that overlook the runway that are on the far side, on the west side, southwest side, and you can see the clubhouse that are towards the north end of the runway, also on the northwest side. And you can see the hazard advisor starting to show the Black Mountain Range, and that's the mountain range that has Mount Mitchell, which is the highest peak east of the Mississippi. Mountain Air traffic, sling 1 off the mic, right downwind, 32 Mountain Air. And you can see the terrain showing up on my G3X as well as the ForeFlight.
Yeah, no report air traffic.
Alright, I can see the runway there. I see the first little valley, and the second valley is a little more populated. That's Pensacola, and that's where you want to turn your base. Alright, there it is. Just a few buildings, a church, and some reservoirs. see I'm a little high. I want to get down to about 5,000 on the base. And I can see my line for the final approach course. I've already got my full flaps in and pre-landing checklist complete. Mountain Air traffic, staying off the mic, right base, 32 Mountain Air. Yeah, I feel like I'm still a little high. I want to get down to 5,000 or so by the time I turn the base to final. Alright, I'm going to start making a shallow base to final turn. And I'm going to start looking for that VASI, and I want solid white.
500.
Mountain Air traffic, still one off the mic, turning final, 32 Mountain Air. Alright, there's the final approach course, and I see the white VASI on the left. Sometimes hard to see during the day, but I see it. Alright, I see the runway markers, I see the touchdown zone markers, and then the next two white lines are your latest touchdown point. Okay, now it's flashing white, so I'm a little high, so I'm going to start coming back down again. Mountain Air traffic, 31 off flank, short final, 32 Mountain Air. Alright, I'm on path, I'm a little fast, so I want to adjust that. Now I'm a little high again. Coming back down. There we go. Alright, welcome to Mountain Air. Mountain Air traffic, sling 1 off the mic, clear of 32 Mountain Air. Alright, here's the tie downs. There's a cable for both your wing and your tail tie down. There are not ropes here, so bring your own ropes.
Now let's talk about departing Mountain Air. The density altitude will have a large effect on your takeoff and departure and climb performance. If you have a normally aspirated piston engine, you will have less power than you normally do. This will lead to a longer takeoff roll and a weaker climb gradient. Even if you have a turbo and you're able to maintain your full rated power, you're still going to lose thrust because the propeller is acting on less dense air. So in either case, you need to check your pilot operating manual for higher density altitude and see what your takeoff distance is and what your climb performance is like. If you have a conventional piston engine with a pilot-controlled mixture lever, you'll want to refer to your manual to determine the proper procedure to lean the mixture for high-density altitude takeoff. As mentioned before, runway 14 is the preferred runway for takeoff. You'll want to utilize as much runway as possible, so you'll back taxi up the hill to the numbers, being the clubhouse. It takes a sharp 180 to get turned around, so make sure your nose wheel is straight once you're set up on the center line. When you're lined up in position for takeoff, it can be a little bit intimidating seeing the Black Mountain Range at the end of the runway there, the highest peak of which is about 2,300 foot higher than the airport elevation. But that mountain range is about 6 miles to the south of the airport. You're not going to try to outclimb it. You've got plenty of distance to just make a left turn out, kind of the reverse of how you came in, and just fly back over Burnsville and make your climb up to your minimum safe altitude for your direction of flight and be on your way. It's a short taxi, so make sure your engine is up to operating temperature, do your run-up, and complete your checklists. The takeoff technique recommended is kind of a standing takeoff, where you begin to add power while holding your brakes. Bring your power up to about 50% while holding your brakes, check that the engine instruments are stable and in the green, then release the brakes and add the remaining of your full takeoff power. The initial acceleration will be slower than it would be at sea level, but the runway is downsloping, so the acceleration will increase as you go down the slope. Rotate at your normal VR, but rotate slowly to stay in ground effect for a bit to allow your airspeed to increase. Airspeed is more important than climb rate initially. You'll have plenty of altitude below you once you're beyond the departure end of the runway due to the rapid drop-off of the terrain. And that's it, you're on your way. Make your left turn and head back over Burnsville as mentioned before. Climb up to 8,000 feet or more and proceed on course. In the event of an engine failure in a single-engine airplane, the density altitude makes a 180 turn back unlikely to be successful. You're better off finding a road or a field down in Pensacola to attempt an off-airport landing. If you've got a ballistic parachute, I would consider using that. As I mentioned, it is a private airport primarily reserved for residents of the flying community. So, is there any way that a non-resident can fly in? Yes. How? Well, one way is a Mountain Air property owner can sponsor you. Some owners make their properties available as vacation rentals. I happen to be one of them. If you rent my property, I can sponsor you. You can view and book a vacation at my property by going to mountaineercondo.com. Then you'll need to go to the fly-in page on the Mountain Air website. Read through the policies and procedures there, complete the registration form, send in a copy of your proof of aircraft liability insurance. A member of the Mountain Air Pilots Association will contact you to conduct a safety briefing. Once that is complete, a Mountain Air POA administrator will send you your PPR number. And that's it. Then you're approved to fly in. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment here or go to mountaineercondo.com, click on contact, and send me a message.